thank you for the kind introduction. As one of the remnants of this panel, I hope that we can well stood up to the expectations of the entire panel. So without further,
make sure our microphone is on. Yeah.
yeah, it's on. It's on.
Oh, there it is.
So, without further ado, the position of the Serbian Church in Yugoslavia was a never-changing reality throughout the years it was subjected to the communist authorities. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the oppression of religion in Yugoslavia followed closely the models of the Bolsheviks. In other words, physical abuse, illegal internments, and killings were all a reality for the Orthodox Church in Yugoslavia, therefore Serbia as well. As was evident in the 1949 letter of the Patriarch Gavrilo to Tito when he wrote that over 60 clergymen of the Serbian Church, including one bishop, were all jailed at the time, and that moreover, in the period between 1946 and 1948, several bishops and metropolitans had been severely beaten, maltreated, or otherwise abused. Popovic himself was not spared such treatment. Near the end of the war, in the spring of 1945 or early 1946, an armed squad of the Secret Service brutally interrupted a liturgy being led by Popovic. His room was ransacked, and even the Easter eggs that Popovic had received from the local children were broken open in a search for hidden messages. Popovic and another monk were taken into custody under armed escort, so a full armed department of the Secret Service was used to gather two monks. Popovic and Arman were taken into custody under armed escort, and they were held under suspicion of political subversion and submitted to various forms of interrogation and quite possibly torture for no less than 15 days. Popovic and his companion were transferred to a Belgrade prison, and there they were only released after a week, in thanks to the intervention of the Metropolitan of Skopje, Josif Cvijovic, who was acting head of the Serbian Church at the time. Popovic was then moved to the monastery of Celje in 1948, where he spent the remainder of his life, where he died in 1979. And this was essentially a house arrest, and he was there under constant surveillance. The reports of the Secret Service at the time proclaim him as the most darkest persona of the Serbian Church. From the 1950s onwards, the beatings and lynch mobs were replaced by a tight network of informants and other methods of covert surveillance. Informants monitored sermons and activities of numerous clergymen and reported on alleged hostile sentiments. Furthermore, the state engaged in a series of divide et impera practices that involved the usage of informants and other means of subterfuge to incite schisms and breaks within larger religious organizations, with the goal of gaining control of the new splinter groups and ultimately their final dissolution. These activities ranged from open support and involvement in the establishment of national churches, such as the Macedonian or the Montenegrin Orthodox Church, to the establishment of priestly associations, which were an effective tool to sow discord between the ecclesial structures. Those priests who agreed to become members of these associations received various privileges from the state, such as health care, pensions, easier travel arrangements, issues of passports, etc. On the other hand, the refusal to participate or to be a member of this membership in these associations came at a high price, including intimidations and beatings. According to a study done in 2004, Orthodox priests in Yugoslavia were more likely to be found participating in these associations than the Roman Catholic ones. In a report by the Secret Service in 1951, more than 80% of the priests of the Serbian Church were found in these associations, as opposed to 27% of the Roman Catholics ones. And in 1955, there's a trend downward, because we see that 71% of the priests was found in these associations. This trend downward continues throughout the history of Yugoslavia. While the clergy seemed willing to accept the new social reality, the majority of the bishops were not. The minority of priests who remained outside these associations were described as closely connected with their bishops, as fanatics, etc. The results of this divisive tactic were perceived as a success by the regime. A report from 1957 boasts of a significant improvement in normalizing the relations between the state and the church. Furthermore, the report highlights the successful quote-unquote differentiation between the faithful, the lower clergy, and a section of the higher clergy from the most reactionary sections of the clergy, which were antagonistic towards the regime and the new Yugoslavia. This was the context in which Popovic reacted to the state-proclaimed good relations between the regime and the Serbian church. The original manuscript of the article we are focused on today, entitled "The Truth About the Serbian Orthodox Church in Communist Yugoslavia," was completed and prepared for print in January 1960 under the name "The Memoranda on the Persecution of the Serbian Orthodox Church under Communists." However, according to Atanasius Jevtic, the retired bishop of Zahumlje and Herzegovina and the greatest expert on Popovic, arguably also his protege at one point, the publication was postponed until such a time that it would not endanger the church. This happened 30 years later, so the first publication came out in 1990. In an article, in the section of the article entitled "The Serbian Church in Communist Yugoslavia," Popovic offers an analysis of the situation in the Serbian Orthodox Church. The goal of this was arguably to set the record straight, as it were, and to combat the rosy image the communist authorities portrayed to the outside world. Popovic offered point by point an account of the ways in which the communist authorities worked towards the destruction of the Serbian church. Now, here we will focus only on one aspect in particular, namely the issue of priestly associations. The priestly associations are described by Popovic as, and I quote, "point blank an agency of the Secret Service," end quote, and moreover, open quote, an anti-dogmatic, anti-canonical, anti-evangelical, anti-ecclesial monstrosity, an apocalyptic beast disguised as a social and a welfare angel, end quote. Popovic claims in the text that aside from the leadership, who are communists essentially, all other priests are in dissociation as a result of being pressured by the Secret Service. The activity of dissociation is described by Popovic as, I quote, "not belonging to the church neither by its essence nor by its actions, since its very existence is aimed against the church by causing scandals and destroying the church. Even if this association performs activities in the name of the church, it does so only as a communist Trojan horse," end quote. His assessments of almost all aspects and activities of the priestly association and the state for that matter aimed against the Serbian church and religion in general were pretty much confirmed by the now available and released internal memos of the Committee for Religious Matters. However, in the case of the number of willing priests in the association, Popovic had been over-optimistic. In reports, often internal and classified, from the year this text was written, and that is 1959, almost all regional communist authorities in Serbia were reporting excellent cooperation of priests with the regime, while the bishops, and often younger priests, were described as being problematic because bishops disciplined those priests who were members of the association, and younger priests were seen as reactionary and fanatics. Popovic decries the persecution of the Serbian church as akin to the persecutions of emperors Diocletian and Nero, and the entire state of Yugoslavia as a giant Diocletian's amphitheater and a Babylonian furnace in which all faithful Serbs are to be either made to apostatize or die. Regarding theological criticism of the communist regime, it could be said that this particular article is well within Popovic's established criticism of Western Christianity and culture. In the first section of the article, entitled "On the Relationship of the Church Towards the Establishment," we find what would now be called public or political theology, namely the claim, "we must obey God rather than human beings," a quote from the Acts 5, verse 29. Now, does that mean that all civil authority was to be rejected? Was Popovic an anarchist? The answer is unsurprisingly no. Popovic sees authority as God-given in principle, as was seen in Romans 13, and as the intended regulator of the divine order of things and a protector against anarchy. Moreover, loyalty to civil authority is dependent on its role as, and I quote, "the sword against those who do evil," end quote. And when that sword turns against the church and its members, the oath of loyalty to such authority is broken. At that point, it becomes a duty of all Christians to fight it with evangelical means. What Popovic considers evangelical means is not clarified in the article and will be explored in the final version of this text. However, we could say that the article offers a list of 37 saints and martyrs who perished for their faith in Christ in the face of persecution as exemplars of such fighters. Therefore, it could be deduced that any type of physical or aggressive form of resistance is not implied or suggested by Popovic. We would even suggest that the first part of the article, was aimed at his readers at home more so than abroad, since, as we mentioned, a significant part of the clergy of the Serbian Church was willing to cooperate with communist authorities. Therefore, civil authority is to be respected by the Church and its members insofar as the authority is faithful to the teaching of Christ. This is the first theological basis or pillar of opposition to communism, since an openly and actively atheist and anti-religious authority must be regarded opposed to God and his laws. This primacy of the divine over human is very significant, especially in relation to his other writings. Near the end of the article, expanding on the topic of the primacy of obedience to God over obedience to humans, Popovic writes, and I quote, "In the God-man, in his works and his body of the Church, God always comes first and humanity second. The Church is a theoanthropological organism first and an organization second. Because of that, she, the body of the God-man, has to look, see, and measure everything by the measurements of God, never humanly or according to humans. Always, 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 we must obey God rather than human beings." End quote. For anyone familiar with Popovic's writings on ecumenism, this will sound very familiar. This is precisely the criticism he directs at Western Christianity and Western culture in general, namely that it is little more than humanism. And humanism for Popovic is what Western Christianity morphed into as a result of the application of the model of papal primacy and supremacy, which hijacked the role of Christ in the Church, and in Protestant societies was manifest in the cult of the individual. That is to say, every human became a micro-pope and thereby the ultimate authority for himself and the world, leaving no room for Christ. Therefore, communism is guilty of the same sin as the Roman Church was, the replacement of Christ by an idol. In case of Yugoslavia, Popovic points to the state-endorsed atheism, named by him the dictatorship of atheism, as essentially a new state religion, and as the renaissance of pagan idol worship, wherein the place of God is occupied by a new deity, the communist state, which is to be worshipped alongside a new pantheon of gods, including positivistic science, materialistic philosophy, communist ethics, anarchist aesthetics, socialist realistic literature, and so forth. He describes this movement in the following words, and I quote, "What is it? A revived idol worship, a revived pagan polytheism, a revived fetishism. There are countless gods and lesser gods and godlings, idols and lesser idols in the place of one and true God and Lord Jesus Christ. They strive to be atheists, but they are in fact polytheists and idol worshippers. As a result of all this, there is a revival of atheistic, polytheistic life, mindset, understanding, practice, and lifestyle. And thus, all life flows in detestable idolatry." End quote. In another text, Popovic suggests a far more sinister connection between the papacy and communism. That is, the use of violence and disregard for the value of the person. And I quote, "We shouldn't be fooled. Papism is the father of fascism and communism, and all other organizations and movements willing to manage and satisfy humankind through violent and mechanical, that is, technical means. Fascism is an idolatry of a nation, and communism is an idolatry of class. Both want to arrange and satisfy the world with the fire and the sword. Both identify the sinner with the sin, and for it proceed to kill the human. Do you know who taught them that? Their very father, papism." End quote. In conclusion, in spite of some differences in the implementation of communist principles in the lands that were part of the Soviet zone of influence, the war against religion and the persecution of religious groups was not a practice where the communists of Yugoslavia were behind their Soviet counterparts. On the contrary, according to recent research, it would appear that, in fact, the Yugoslav evolved model was even more effective than the Bolshevik original. Justin Popovic was very much aware of the dangers of communism due to his connections with the members of the Russian Church abroad and his own personal experiences of physical and other forms of abuse. However, even he, in spite of his relative fame, was in a sense powerless to stop their disruptive activities aimed against the Serbian Church. Having lived through all stages of persecution and experienced the various clandestine ways the regime was subverting his church, whom he valued above everything, Popovic tried to fight back in his own way and wrote a desperate letter to those willing to listen. I presented some parts of it today, and I have hopefully shown that Popovic was very much aware of the shadow play of the regime's agents, since his observations on the types of activities the regime was undertaking against the Serbian church, as well as their intended results, were pretty much confirmed by the now available internal memos of the regime. The same optimism which led Popovic to believe that a simple text could have made a significant difference, were it to be published when it was originally written, might have led Popovic to believe that the reach and influence of the communist authorities over the Serbian clergy was mainly fear-driven, and that the communists had very few real supporters and collaborators among his peers. This, as we have seen from the internal memos, was sadly not the case. What were the consequences for the Serbian church of these communist manipulations are yet to be properly analyzed. Now, regarding his theological objections to the communist regime, all of Popovic's arguments are derived from one major principle, namely the primacy of the divine over the human. In view of stance to authority, this translates as follows. The human authority comes from the submission to the authority of God. This submission to the authority of God is, at the same time, the legitimizing factor of human authority. Once removed, any such authority or power becomes illegitimate. Communists, according to Popovic, were guilty of a series of major transgressions in this schema, not least of which were the denial of God's existence, that is atheism, the usurpation of God's place, that is idolatry, and the persecution of God's faithful. Furthermore, and lastly, it is in this principle of the dominion of the divine over human where the connection is made with his famous opposition to ecumenism as it was practiced during his lifetime. Thank you for your attention.